Welcome to another in our series of On Further Reflections with Norm Allen. We've had a few of these videos and podcasts over the last year, and we hope this one will be of interest and some encouragement to you as you have a chance to meet my friend Hugh Brewster, who is sort of the next generation of Touchstone circles of friendship. He and I have been friends for nearly 10 years. And his dad has been a friend of mine for a lot longer than that. But we've been on journey together over that period of time, and he leads one of our younger leaders, our younger generation group. I called them the young lean guys when we first got started because they were in their 30s and a lot leaner than me. And they're now starting to catch.
What are you saying? What are you saying, Norm? Say it. Just say it to my face.
But they're starting to see the degradations of age as they get to their mid 40s, and so it's fun. And so Hugh and I have been on journey together. He's executive director of a nonprofit. He's a husband. He's a father. He's a world-class Frisbee player. So we're going to have a conversation around some of those subjects, and but first I'll get him to give us a little thumbnail sketch on who he is, and then we'll just chat away for a while.
Thanks, Norm. Yeah, I think you covered the key themes, I guess, in terms of a thumbnail sketch. I mean, professionally, I started off as a high school teacher, but most of my career has been spent in the nonprofit or NGO space. Some stints with UNICEF, 10 years with World Vision, a little bit with Refugee Reception in Toronto, and then currently I lead a small international NGO headquartered in Toronto called Transforming Faces, where we support teams that care for kids born with cleft lip and palate. Beyond that, Frisbee, ultimate Frisbee is one of the passions of my life, has been for a long time. And I get a lot of joy out of that. And then definitely my identity as a dad and a father is a huge element of who I am. My eldest is almost 15, going into grade 10. My middle child is 8.5, going into grade 4, and then my smallest child, who's a boy, he's going to be going to JK in the fall. So a bit of a range. It's busy times. The pandemic is not easy for parents, and I don't think anyone's going to come peek through my little screen here, but it has happened on Zoom calls where the little face will appear. I'm like, why is that person looking at me funny? Oh, it's my daughter is peeking through my screen. So this might happen, but just be forewarned. So we'll start right now. Yep, and I've been married for 20 years to my wife Leanne, whose background's in education and a bunch of other things, and we co-own a house. So there's another family that we went in on together 14 years ago to sort of split a Toronto house. We each have our own kitchens, our own spaces, but kind of an innovative model at that time, and we set up shop here much longer than I thought we necessarily thought we would, but we're really happy here in East Toronto.
And you're one of those people who takes advantage of the bike lanes in Toronto. So you
100%. Yeah, I think in the last year, I've taken transit to work, maybe 2 times, so I really am. Now I've graduated from just using my own bike. I'm not a great bike mechanic. So in the wintertime, they have a bike share program. So I bought a year of membership. Anytime it's crappy weather or snow or sleet or rust or whatever, I just borrow the city's bike, get to work, and take it back.
Hey, one of the things that over our 10 years of friendship that has been interesting to observe is sort of you're developing as with more and more responsibility in your vocation. And you're now the executive director, as you said, of Transforming Faces, which is a Canadian based but international work to children who have experienced cleft palate and need not only the surgery, but need all the attendant services in terms of speech therapy and maybe even dental care and all of that sort of thing that may go on for several years and maybe subsequent surgery. So you work quite differently than what most of us would think about surgeons flying over from Canada. So can you talk a bit about the work that you're doing?
Sure. Yeah, delighted to. So I've been with Transforming Faces for over 3.5 years now, and I think one of the things that really delighted me as I was considering this job was its model. And the first thing, as you mentioned, is Transforming Faces is 20 years old now, and from the very beginning has not relied on flying surgeons from Toronto or elsewhere in to do the work. So from the beginning, there was some really good advice given to the founders saying, you know what, there are people in Ethiopia, in India, in Peru who can do this work. And what they might be requiring is some funding. They might be requiring some training or some capacity building. But your role can be more of a supporter as opposed to a doer. And I think that resonates really with my understanding of international development. That eventually we want to work ourselves out of a job, right? We don't want to continue to do this. And so at some stage, when governments have developed and economies have developed to the point where they can sustain this, we want cleft lip and palate to be something that every family has access to care for, and that every child born with cleft lip and palate would go on to be able to live a full life and pursue their dreams.
Now, you had a virtual annual meeting, which I attended a few weeks ago, and in there was a video with stories of children and their parents and comments. And one of the things that struck me, apart from the joy of seeing some of these restored faces, was sort of the undergirding spiritual conflict, or whatever you want to call it, that people experience shame because it was a curse from God, and also gratitude to God when they saw, the transformed face. So that there was this really interesting nexus of weird religious thinking that connects with the work that you're doing.
Certainly. Yeah. So, I think that the context is quite different. Transforming Faces works in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. So, different beliefs, different worldviews in each of those places. But one thing that does link all the families that we support together is a sense of that in the community there is bias. There's the idea that shame should be associated with cleft lip and palate, and then in some places, definitely, that this is definitely a spiritual problem. That in India there can be the belief that this is somehow karma. That if a mother goes outside in a full moon, then this is the punishment to the cleft lip and palate. Or in Myanmar, the idea that maybe you laughed at a child who had a disability and this is your payback. In Uganda, the idea that maybe this is a spiritual practice from a neighbor who's out to get you, and this is sort of the manifestation of that would be a child born with cleft lip and palate. But I think our hopes for our kids are really much tied up into how we see the world, and in many places there is this idea that a physical manifestation of something that's different or scary or unusual is actually the reflection of a spiritual reality, and that's very difficult. So on top of the shock of a mother or hopefully a parents, seeing a child come into the world that looks different, there's also immediately this shame. Whose fault was it? Who did this to you? Or how could you produce a child like this? And so, it's quite common, unfortunately, for men in particular to disappear in many of the countries in which we work. After a child is given birth that has cleft lip or palate, then the dad just takes off. So there is a spiritual, I think, element to it. And then also, yeah, that on the other side, as you saw in that short video, people will return to give thanks to God for a successful result. If they see that their child, who they thought maybe life was over, there was no hope, that they would never move forward, seeing that my child can go on and can get married, can go to school, can have a fulfilling life. I mean, that is something that people bring back into their real experience of joy and gratitude to God.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have a lot of that strains of that same sort of religious thinking, either in the sense when a tragedy happens, that it's a judgment of God on a particular community of people because they're evil or whatever it might be, but they're definitely different from whoever is exercising the judgment. Or it becomes, why was God not doing something different, as opposed to maybe God is present in the surgeons and physiotherapists and speech therapists and all that sort of thing that might go on in what you're doing in the face of something that's quite difficult. Because it's also, there's a gender thing there, it sounds like, in the sense that women can become victimized and blamed for something that is, it's just something.
Exactly. Yeah, no, there is that definite element. I mean, it's different in every country. I don't want to summarize everyone's
Right.
experience, but that theme that women disproportionately bear the brunt of community expectations, familial expectations, husbands' expectations, that's definitely a factor. And you talk about here in Canada, I mean, I think that there are manifestations of that. I mean, even in the expression that sometimes people will say, oh, well, God wouldn't give you more than you can bear, or, oh, if you lose a child, then, oh, well, it's God needed another angel. I mean, these are
Right.
really corrosive, unhelpful beliefs that I'm not sure where they come from. There's some of them are rooted in a particular faith tradition or Christian tradition. Others are just sort of out there, it's sort of a nice thing to say to somebody. But in my experience, it's a very unhelpful thing to say to somebody.
Now, just you were telling me earlier this morning that you had just come off a video conference with 60 or more people from around the world with some experts in your area. Obviously, the work isn't going on in a lot of countries because of the pandemic. Maybe it started again in some places, but you've been restricted in not being able to travel. Talk about what you were doing this morning with
Sure.
around the
Yeah.
world.
So, I mean, the other element of that's distinctive about Transforming Faces and really exciting for me is that it embraces the idea that this sort of akin to how you have treatment here in Canada for a cleft lip and palate. It's not just a surgery, right? So surgeries are important. They're critical. You want to have a good surgery to get your child off to a good start. But kids generally need, especially with a cleft palate, they'll generally need speech therapy in order to communicate clearly. There'll be challenges often with teeth and with oral hygiene. There even could be issues with kids' jaws. So, I mean, it requires a team-based approach. And so from the beginning, Transforming Faces has been able to embrace saying, yeah, we need a team-based approach. It needs to be multidisciplinary, and it needs to have that sense of working together, all the different disciplines. So from the beginning, also because we don't travel individually to do the work, I mean, obviously I love to get out and be able to train and facilitate discussions, look on strategy, meet with families, but the work itself of treatment happens from locals. And so the idea of trying to do some of that support virtually has been part of how we've had to do things. And then even more so now. So under the pandemic, we had a discussion this morning with 3 really dynamic speech therapy professionals, one from India, one from Nigeria, one from Santiago de Chile, and each sharing the strategies that they're employing right now to try to reach families during the pandemic. So that has to do with telehealth. How can you use whatever resources are available to be able to do speech therapy by smartphone or by the computer? What else can you be doing in terms of face masks and getting access to different types of protective equipment that will allow you to continue the work? So the work continues. It's very difficult. I mean, my heart breaks especially, and I think that was reflected this morning in the discussion for the most vulnerable. So I think around the world we're saying, the idea is that it affects all boats. All of us are in the same sea, but the way it affects or the impact of the storm is very disproportionate. That the most vulnerable are the most affected, and that's even more so true in places where, for example, our partner in India was sharing, yeah, there are some families for whom finding enough food for that day is actually a higher priority than speech therapy, and we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge that we can't insist these parents bring their kids for speech therapy when they're spending a lot of their day under the pandemic where their regular job is interrupted, just making sure that they can feed their kids. I think that the opportunities through Zoom and other media are so important, and it's something that Transforming Faces is really invested in, as well as the idea of collaborating. So, my sector unfortunately has a real history of competition and some really negative ways of kind of carving out space for each other. And as a smaller organization, and a Canadian-based organization in particular, we've been able to really try to lean in to the idea of being a catalyst for collaboration. So this morning's call, we had 60 professionals from about 20 different countries, and that would be reflective of a variety of different cleft NGOs and beyond, academics, et cetera, all saying, no, we want to work together to find solutions, to hear one another, and especially to lift up the voices from those leaders in the field, in places that are actually doing the work, as opposed to sort of saying, oh, well, the experts from Toronto, like me or whatever, are the ones that need to be teaching everybody. So that's been an important part of the ethos for TF that I've really appreciated.
Now, you were also supposed to be representing Canada in some major frisbee competition in Australia. Talk a little bit about how you got into frisbee and how you're able to, even in your dotage, able to continue to compete at a high level.
Sure. Well, thank you. Yes, my dotage. Well, yes, I'm a passionate fan of ultimate frisbee. I think I probably started at Pioneer Camp as a boy or a teenager, where we were throwing around discs. I'm sure playing without any rules. But in university at that time, when I got started, was where most people picked up, the sport. With rules and a way of playing and everything else. And from the beginning, it really captured me. I'd grown up as a soccer player. But I think both the combination of the small, fine motor skills of learning how to throw the disc in all these different ways, combined with the really highly aerobic, you're cutting, you're running, you're always in motion. Those two things really appealed to me. And I think the third element that's always been my passion is team sports. So I can motivate myself to do training or running or everything on my own, but really it's a means to an end. Like I really like to express that with others, and that idea of a team journey, people working together, expressing different things. That's been a key focus for me. So yeah, I've had the opportunity 4 years ago to represent Canada at the World Championships in UK. And then this time in an older division, so now I'm in the 40 plus division, but I was selected for the national team to compete in Australia. And unfortunately, along with the Olympics and everything else, that's been postponed. Hopefully it gets off the ground next year. I mean, we'll have to see whether my finances and everything allow for me to try to do it next time. But yeah, we're waiting to see, and it's a joy to compete at the international level too with these guys who are also, kind of crazy about this sport. So.
Now, we started sort of intentional conversation around 10 years ago. I was going back through some date books trying to figure out where it all started, and we had met, we knew each other because your dad's a friend of mine for a long standing, but we ran into each other at a conference about younger leaders and had a conversation around next generation leadership. And when you asked me a couple of questions about what I thought about your generation of leadership, I mentioned that when I was your age at the time, which was in your late 30s, I was starting Touchstone, and I was thinking about it, and I was getting advice from various people. And I went to a guy who essentially was my age, in his 60s back then. And he discouraged me completely. Just, there was no need for what I was thinking about. And I just realized that I never wanted to be that kind of a person. And your generation has to figure out your own way of doing things, but maybe the old guys can, give you a bit of wisdom and perspective on some things, but you still have to develop your own spiritual journey, your own leadership style, and all that sort of thing. And so talk a little bit about what fuels your inner person as you go about this work and sports and family and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. Um, I think one of the things that's been a major blessing in my life is, as I talked about my career, but, I've been able to find roles that allow me to express my spiritual beliefs, in a tangible way. Transforming Faces, the charity I lead, is not a religious organization, and yet it embraces this idea that even kids born with cleft lip and palate, are important. Their story is meaningful, and that fundamentally, many of our partners around the world would say, yeah, we think of kids being a gift from God, or in Christian terms, in my own terms, made in God's image. That every human person has that innate value and that call to be able to pursue a full life, over, in my case, a lot of times, wrestling against the barriers of poverty, and yet through that sense of accompaniment, that God is rooting for us and spurring us on to be able to really express some of that creativity and joy that we have in us based on our createdness. So it's been lovely to partner with people in places like Ethiopia, Thailand, Myanmar, who from their own perspectives have really embraced this particular niche of disability or development work that's at our intersection, and that has really been a fuel of passion for me, saying, I want these children to be able to experience a full life, to be able to pursue a real meaningful inclusion in their communities, and that's a spiritual value for me. When it comes to sports, I think that as I touched on, I think that idea of teamwork, that is something, I think a lot of people experiencing me as kind of an intense, kind of serious guy in some ways, but I mean
Well,
that
they definitely experience you as an intense, serious guy, and
um,
that's good.
yeah, I think my teammates would probably say the same thing. But there is an emotional element, for me about that journey of working together, and that I experienced in my small team in Toronto. I experienced that in that solidarity of trying to work well, be a good support, to be able to let others lead in their own context, but be that supportive, but working together. That moves me, and that's some of my greatest joys. I mean, I was just reflecting during this pandemic. I came across one of those tournament draw sheets, and this was a tournament, where you go to the main space. Some of you who do sports would know this, and you kind of keep track of whatever else is doing, and they write down the score, and then if you make the semis, then you go to the finals or whatever. So someone found that, and this was from 6 years ago now, a
And you
tournament.
were a much younger man.
Yeah, and that's why I circulated it among, through the pandemic. It was kind of being dropped off on people's porches and went on to the next guy. They would add some comments and put all the way through. But, when I think about a time of great joy and fulfillment in my life, I remember after winning this tournament. So this was a tournament that happened in Winnipeg, and it was for the right to represent Canada. It meant that your team would be the core. Obviously they'd add other people, but if you won this tournament, and it happened to be against our arch nemesis, some of these key guys who'd always beaten us from Vancouver. So, we worked all the way through the tournament for this moment, and it was in doubt. We were behind, we might not pull it out, and then we came and we triumphed. And I remember sitting back, with a beer, looking, where all of us, our socks are off, and we're just looking out at the sunset and think, this is amazing. We did it. We worked for, months and months and months, years really, to get to this point. And now, that payoff is like, hey, we're going to represent Canada in a big tournament. So I think that idea of both the created, that being created in God's image, but also that sense of wanting to work together, of having a story that leads people to really be motivated on a vision, with passion, to pursue a goal together, to really appreciate one another. That's something that for me in Frisbee has been really true. And thankfully, I've been able to experience quite a bit of that in my professional life as well.
And in one of the places where we connect is in the area of contemplative prayer and in spiritual friendship, the concept that we try to develop some inner stillness so that we can listen to the moves of the Spirit in our own lives, and then conceivably partner up with some friends and do the same thing for each other. So that team thing, you've been part of helping create a group that we worked together with a couple of other fellows nearly 10 years ago to create, and you're now meeting regularly. Can you talk a little bit about that team and what you do together?
Yeah, and I think that ties a little bit into your question about the younger leaders, and even if we're not so young anymore, but we've really developed over time, a liturgy or an agenda of how we meet that's been really helpful. So for us, it's all men, all dads, all husbands, who are trying to do well in all of those areas. And as opposed to having, while I give some leadership, or my friend Tim gives leadership to the structure and to making things work. Really, when we show up on a Wednesday morning on Zoom right now, for example, it's not like someone's developed a study to take us through. There's a moment of centering around some of these contemplative prayer that's really helpful. I think it really anticipates a little bit that we started this current fad of having, and hopefully it's more than a fad, but I mean this idea of having an app that helps you be mindful or do some meditation. I mean, we have that sense of centering in. There's a passage from Scripture that we read a couple times together out loud. That we spend some time just thinking about what resonates, from the news into that passage or into our own lives. And then we move to a time of just doing some updates on those key elements that are happening in our life in all those spheres, and maybe allowing some of that sacred story that we looked at that morning to inform our discussion or challenge us in new ways. And that's been sort of an agenda that's kind of worked itself through, and has had some ebbs and flows, but there really is a core group of guys who look forward to it, weekly, to be able to come and go through this. We know what we expect out of the time, and then there really is some excellent trust and understanding that's built between the guys in this kind of team element, as you brought up.
Like, I think one of the things that you do well, and I think when we're on our game in our circles in our little racket here at Touchstone, uh, it's understanding that we're part of this ongoing story of God's engagement with humanity, as opposed to each spiritual event is sort of a transaction. And so all you're doing is picking up a conversation that goes on. Many people are doing their own intentional praying on their own, but at the same time, you're connecting once a week as part of an ongoing story. It's not, okay, now this is our religious moment. This is just a conversation about what's going on in our story. And I think you guys have done a good job of that particular thing. One of the other places where you and I started to meet sort of on a regular basis for a while, you experienced a significant loss around 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And I wonder if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about that, because that's been a very shaping experience for you and Leanne, and many of us who've watched you process this thing.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think the group, at that time at least, and definitely through the years since, has been helpful for me in sort of processing some of that experience, which was, 10 years ago. I guess it was more like almost 11 years ago, I guess now. My wife and I were pregnant with our second child. It had been a bit of a difficult journey to get to that second pregnancy, and about halfway through, had an ultrasound routine that was routine until it started not being routine. Until it started saying, well, just let me check one more thing, and maybe we should check somewhere, and then, oh, why don't the two of you wait outside, while I look at something else? And of course, we're looking at each other thinking, what is this? This can't be good. And probably one of the most difficult days of my life, sort of waiting from there to get referred to somebody else, and then ultimately having someone with some authority saying, based on what we've seen, that we don't expect your child to have a long life outside the womb, and basically this should be we should be scheduling to end this pregnancy. So I mean that's a bit of a shortened version, but obviously devastating, all the different words, and I think as we think about what our own commitments, without talking about anyone else's or anything, anybody else's story, but for us, my wife Leanne and I both had a strong sense that since our son was totally healthy, happy as far as we knew, doing all the right things inside the womb, that our responsibility to be parents, whatever that looked like, would extend further. That our child wasn't in any pain. There was nothing else that was wrong, except that once our son made it outside of the womb, his life was likely going to be quite short. And so there was a journey, then of months, of looking forward to his birth, but also grieving his birth, looking forward to what was coming and being grateful, and yet also having such profound sadness, of our dreams for our son likely being crushed, and yet holding on to some other hope that this was still the right and faithful thing to do to continue this story as long as it could. And I think he was born, and his sojourn on this side of the womb was quite short, and that was a huge disappointment. Even amidst a larger season of sorrow, that was even still a very big disappointment, and very difficult.
And you ended up having to make choices that obviously you named him Josiah.
That's right.
And you did have a funeral. And so you did all the things that maybe went against what was expected, but treated him with the same dignity that you would have treated any other child, which is one of your core values as you expressed it as it related to Transforming Faces. But it's something that's a core of who you and Leanne are. And yet then, even though that then was sorrowful, then you had lots of time over the next years to process grief, and both of you processing it differently. And so, out of all of that, what are the lessons that you've learned out of the experience?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that that is um, helpful observation, that it's not a question of, months or weeks of journeying. There was a journey to get to the pregnancy. There's a journey to Josiah's birth, and then there's definitely been an ongoing journey since his death. And I think my wife, who has done quite a bit of thinking and study about grief, wouldn't describe grief as something that you get over, but you're hopefully moving to a space of integration, where my son's life and death is just part of who I am and part of the story. Uh, and obviously has emotion attached to it, but is not something that's debilitating, on a daily basis at this point.
But
Um,
it's not like it disappears.
no, no, it's integration, right? It's part of who we are and who I am, and who my wife and I are. My family is.
Like
Um,
a friend of mine, he lost a daughter to suicide when she was a teenager, and it's a long, long time ago, 25 years or more. And he says you never get over it, but it's soil out of which the rest of your life grows. So it becomes a place from which other things emerge, capacity to care for others, whatever it might be. And my observation would be that that's been part of your formation and your capacity for friendship with others and compassion for the world or whatever.
Certainly, yeah, definitely learned a lot through that experience. I mean, I think one of the things that I try to be more intentional about is when someone's going through something devastating and horrible, uh, trying not to just shy away, trying to lean in. And so I think I've learned it's often people, for good reason, are trying to manage their own insecurities, their own hurts, their own fear of messing up, and so their response can be to say nothing or to withdraw. And I think I've seen up close that can be quite painful. Obviously, our story was one of great support. At the church community we were part of at the time, sent people over to do our dishes, in the evenings, so that my wife and I could have a chance to chat or just to be quiet at the end of the day. We had friends who were very, willing and faithful to walk alongside and just journey with us. And yet, you also remember, the assumptions that people can bring, or the things people can say, such as you mentioned, like a health professional, counselor saying, well, no one would ever have a funeral for an infant. I mean, who knows the infant, and just, that does stick. I mean, vulnerable time, saying the wrong thing does hurt. And yet, the answer is not to say nothing, right? The answer is to be invitational. And I think I've learned a little bit about that with my group or with other friends, saying, how can I make myself a little bit uncomfortable as someone who's more secure right now and less vulnerable? How can I make myself be the one that's a little bit uncomfortable in engaging and offering the opportunity for someone to share if they want, but also being quite willing to step back if the person gives the signal saying, I hear you, and no, that's not, or even, being specific about the ways I could help. I mean, I think lots of people would say, oh, let me know if I can do anything. But if you're in a really dark space, if you're going through something traumatic, it's really difficult to reach out and say, hey, would you do this for me? So I've learned, obviously, it's more helpful to say, would this be helpful? Can I do this one thing for you? Or would you accept this? And the person can always say no, and that might hurt a little bit, but obviously they're the ones you're trying to, so making yourself a little bit uncomfortable to make them feel more comfortable, I think is a key practice in spiritual friendship.
Yeah, and I think that you're on to sort of a couple of the core things that we've over the years learned, and I still don't practice as well as I wish, but in the sense that
Mm.
when you're coming to people, you're coming to serve not your own needs, but whatever needs may ultimately be revealed. And sometimes our expectation or our definition of what their needs are is actually not accurate. And so going and listening and then waiting for invitation to participate at whatever level people invite us to participate becomes, it's a discipline. And so there's so much of what we do, we're trying to, in a sense, fulfill either, as to your point, our own insecurity, but go be present. And you never know, something may just show up that you can go do or whatever. But by
Mhm.
being present and then being invited and letting other people set the terms of the relationship, there's a kind of freedom in that becomes quite enriching.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Now, we've covered a fair bit of ground today. One of the things that I've appreciated about my relationship with you is that you're a plain spoken fellow. You do provide some significant leadership to that group that it meets. We had a hilarious kind of exchange when the Zoom thing started. You made the mistake of inviting me to participate in the first Zoom meeting of your group. And I was thrilled. I thought, this is great. I get to see these guys, and I participated in my own particular way. And apparently, so then I was looking for the invitation for the following week, and I couldn't find it in my calendar. So I emailed you and your partner in crime and said, I can't find the invitation. And he said, well, I deliberately didn't invite you because you changed the nature of what we do. And so you've decided that I can help. And so once a month I get to participate and maybe bring an idea to consider. But it was really a liberating thing for me to discover, okay, I would love to participate because I have a need to be engaged, and I'm trying to find my way in this Zoom world. And yet I had to figure out, okay, do I really want to help, or do I just want to be stimulated? And so the capacity you guys had to actually say, no, you're not helpful in this way, but you are helpful in this way, was really it was like a perfect kind of conversation. And so I'm grateful for that experience that we've shared together. And I then was able to pass that on to our group that's 10 years your junior. And so they managed to say, okay, Norm, don't come and participate in our Zoom stuff either. So there is something about being able to be honest with each other about the helping process that really is liberating for everybody.
Yeah, and I think, you identify some of the uncomfortableness too of renegotiating roles, right? So, our group really appreciates you and everything else, and yet we want to acknowledge, there is a different dynamic when there's someone who's older and wiser and, looks more
No,
handsome, maybe.
just older.
But there is an incredible resonance, I think, to my professional life too. I mean, as a Canadian-based NGO, we don't want to be the stars of the show. When we're thinking about cleft lip and palate care, we want the people working in Ethiopia to be the stars of the show. And eventually we want the governments to take over the role that we're fighting, even around funding. And that's hard, and I think some of my other colleagues in the charity world, find that even harder because, there is something fulfilling about traveling over and, doing surgeries or whatever it is. The reality is that you're stuck in a paradigm, that is actually causing a lot more trouble. There is a way for you to be helpful. And I think that's, the line, obviously, at Transforming Faces we're trying to walk, and how we can be helpful with the resources and the situation and the expertise that we have. And yet, how can we not be the stars of the show? How can we not be indispensable? How can we be flexible to move? And I think that's part of a spiritual friendship group too, is saying leadership's important, structure is really important. And yet, how can we build it? And I think that's what our group has been able to do, is saying, yeah, sure, there's Tim and I and a few other, who play some leadership roles. And yet I'm not showing up to be like, okay, here's Hugh's 5 reflections on this passage this week, and Tim's gonna be next week, and whoever else. It's like, no, we've got a bit of a sense of how it works. Anyone can run it. We all hold each other accountable. Maybe I'm going to be holding people a little bit more accountable if they're, if they're not fulfilling what our accountability is or whatever else. But in general, everyone can say, no, I'm going to do this, or how about this question? So you're getting out of that situation, which is what I want to do in my professional life too, of saying, no, it's not just like question, leader says something, someone else answers, leader says something else, someone else answers, it's like, let's build this like a web, right? We all have something to learn. We all have something to offer. And that's been something that really animates me and has kept us involved and kept me involved for 9 years.
Yeah, it's an interesting, years ago, there was an article in Foreign Policy magazine, or its equivalent, about the new colonialism. And it talked about the fact that NGOs and World Bank and all that sort of stuff were becoming the new colonialists, because they were the people going into developing countries to build infrastructure, because they could, and it was the consulting firms, because they had access to capital and resources. And so you were then stealing the best and brightest from the country, from, say, government or healthcare or whatever, and going into the system that became self-perpetuating. And so there is a danger there, and it's a spiritual danger that we can have, where for our own need of being valued that we want to impose ourselves in situations where our value isn't actually there. And we're still valuable, but we're not valued. We're not value added for that circumstance. So any final thoughts before I offer a little Celtic blessing on our time?
I mean, I think, another theme is just that there is a space and a need, I guess, back to the core mission of Touchstone and your mission. My experience has been with guys, but, that sense of intentionality of having a structure that you work through and of sticking with it for the longer haul. That is not something many guys have met, a need people have met elsewhere, and so I think that that's been some of the richness that I've experienced, and then started off as something 9 years ago. I was like, oh, how long do I stick with this? Like, this is and it's something that I look forward to every week, and I think that is that there's a payoff, I guess, of committing to that sort of thing, but it's not like committing in a sense of something that's horrible and you're kind of make it work because you have to, but really that sense of, no, you want to be part of this because there's not other opportunities to speak into guys' lives. And then also just the kinds of professional challenges. I mean, professionally, I could write that off that time if I wanted to, as leadership development, because I'm hearing from these really amazing leaders on the challenges that they're facing. It's making me think about how I'm approaching these different challenges. And our group is actually quite good about sharing, resources from the New Statesman or, from wherever that people are reading and thinking about because it enriches us. So it's kind of a whole package, which is quite lovely.
Yeah. And that's the thing that we've talked about, that you're not doing a particular, in that hour, you're not trying to do a particular religious event or transaction. This is just part of the ongoing story of your lives together, the ongoing story of God's work with us as human beings. And so there's a benefit to seeing it as an ongoing thing. Like, obviously we've got groups where people have been, meeting together for 35 years. And so what you learn about each other over that period of time becomes quite extraordinary. And the ability to say that person knows me and knows my ups and downs and knows my history and then can speak something into my life in a kind way. There's something about that only time and experience and intentionality can develop. Anyway, thank you, Hugh, for taking the time. And let me read this blessing for the inner journey from a book called Anam Cara, or Soul Friend, by John O'Donohue. It's a lovely little piece. May you recognize in your life the presence, power, and light of your soul. May you realize that you are never alone, that your soul and its brightness and belonging connects you intimately with the rhythm of the universe. May you have respect for your own individuality and difference. May you realize that the shape of your soul is unique, that you have a special destiny here, that behind the facade of your life there is something beautiful, good, and eternal happening. May you learn to see yourself with the same delight, pride, and expectation with which God sees you in every moment. Amen and amen. So thank you, friend. And I'll look forward to seeing you when pandemic world is over and we can be face to face.
Tell me when that's going to be. That'd be really helpful for my planning.
I have no skill in the prophecy area. I'm a salesman, so.
Thanks, Norm.
See you, buddy. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.